Everyone feared the Duke's Wolfhound, that was simply a fact of life at Westmere Park, as certain as the frost that crept across the Yorkshire moors each October. As immovable as the stone walls that had stood since the previous century. The creature was called Finn, an Irish wolfhound of extraordinary size, the colour of winter ash. With pale grey eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the person before him. He had bitten a viscount once. The story had passed through the servants' hall with the breathless energy of a scandal that cost nothing to repeat. Lord Moulton had reached out to pet him during a shooting party last autumn, and Finn had turned with a slowness that made it almost considered. And closed his teeth around the man's wrist. Lord Moulton had required 3 stitches, the Duke had expressed his regrets, Finn had expressed nothing at all. So when the notice appeared on the mantelpiece of the servants' hall on a grey Tuesday morning in November. No one was particularly surprised by its contents. They gathered in the way servants do, not quite crowding, but arranging themselves so that everyone could see while appearing merely to pass through. Nora stood at the back, her hands still damp from the morning's first round of cleaning. And waited until the others drifted away before she stepped forward to read it, with immediate effect. No member of staff is to approach the Wolfhound's kennel or training yard. His Grace regrets the incident involving Lord Moulton and asks that all staff exercise appropriate caution. Any person found in proximity to the animal without direct instruction from His Grace will be dismissed without referee. NCE, the ink was very black. The handwriting belonged to Mrs. Harris, the housekeeper. And there was a particular satisfaction in the loops of her letters that Nora had learned to recognize over the past 3 months. Mrs. Harris wrote the way she spoke with the pleasure of a woman delivering consequences she had long felt were deserved. Finally, the voice came from somewhere to Nora. As left. She didn't turn. She knew the voice. It was Martha, one of the upstairs maids, who had perfected the art of saying things that were not quite directed at anyone in particular. Someone's put it in writing. A small sound of agreement rippled through the remaining women. Nora set down her bucket, folded her hands, and read the notice once more. She had met Finn 3 times, the first time had been 6 weeks ago, on a night when she had no particular reason to be sitting on the stone steps behind the kitchen at 11:30 in the evening. Except that the alternative had been lying in the narrow bed she shared with the scullery maid and staring at the ceiling until her thoughts became unbearable. She had been crying, though she had not quite admitted it to herself. It was the sort of crying that happens very quietly, with one's face pressed into one's folded arms, the kind that leaves no evidence by morning. She had not heard him approach. She had simply become aware, gradually, of a warmth against her knees, a heavy, certain pressure, and when she had lifted her head, she had found Finn's great grey face resting in her lap with the unhurried ease of a creature who had decided something and seen no reason to ask permission. She had gone very still. She had been told enough about him to be afraid, but his eyes, when he looked up at her, had been entirely without threat. They had been, and she had thought about this word many times since, turned it over in the quiet of her mind, sorrowful. Not in the way of an animal in pain, but in the way of one who has been carrying something a long time and has simply gotten used to the weight. That I know, those eyes had seemed to say. I know something is wrong with you. I have been carrying something too. She had not moved for a long time. Eventually, she had very slowly lowered her hand and rested it on the top of his head, and he had exhaled a long, slow breath. And they had sat there together in the dark until the kitchen clock struck midnight, and she had remembered herself. The second time had been an accident on both their parts. She had been scrubbing the corridor flagstones, the long corridor that ran past the eastern wing, past the library, past the door that led to the formal room she was not required to enter, and Finn had pushed his nose through the gap in the kennel gate that someone had failed to latch properly. He had trotted down the corridor with an air of mild interest and stopped directly in front of her bucket. She had moved his paw off the stone she was scrubbing. He had put it back. She had moved it again. He had replaced it with the deliberate patience of someone who found the game entertaining. On the 4th repetition, she had caught herself on the edge of a laugh, not quite a laugh, only the breath before one, and had covered her mouth with the back of her hand as though the sound might betray her. It had been the closest she had come to laughing in 4 months. The 3rd time had been yesterday afternoon. And it was the one she kept returning to with the particular discomfort of a person pressing on a bruise. She had come around the corner at the end of the east corridor and found Finn standing in the middle of the passage. The kennel gate must have been left open again. Or perhaps he had simply decided the latch no longer applied to him. He had seen her, and his tail had begun to move, a slow, heavy sweep, and he had taken 2 steps toward her. She had heard footsteps. Mrs. Harris, somewhere behind her, approaching from the servants' staircase, move. She had thought, very distinctly, with the specific clarity that comes when one's circumstances have narrowed to a single point. If she sees you near him. If she has reason. Go. She had kept her voice to barely a breath. You shouldn't be here. I can't. She had put her hand out not to stroke. Not to welcome, but to turn him, to redirect, with a touch that felt like apology and instruction at once. Finn had looked at her hand. He had looked at her face. Then he had turned and walked back down the corridor, not quickly, not with any obvious distress. Simply as though he had reconsidered his plans. Mrs. Harris had rounded the corner a moment later and looked at Nora with the specific assessment of a woman who suspects something but cannot identify it. Nora had gone back to her bucket. Now she stood in front of the notice and read it a third time, and thought, this is right. She could not afford to lose this position. She had nowhere else to go, or rather, she had somewhere to go back to, in the way that people have places they came from. But nothing to return to. 3 months ago she had walked through Westmere Park servants' entrance with a single bag and a name that was not hers, and she had not done so without reason. She needed this job. She needed to stay inside these walls. She needed access to the library specifically. To a section of the library she had not yet been able to reach. Because the library was in the eastern wing and the eastern wing was cleaned by the upstairs staff, she needed Finn to stop choosing her in corridors where anyone might see. She picked up her bucket. Ought to have been written months ago, Mrs. Harris said from behind her. And Nora heard in the woman's voice the specific quality of a satisfaction that had been a long time coming. Some of us knew it was only a matter of time. Nora walked back to the flagstones that needed scrubbing. She did not answer. She had become, over these 3 months, very good at not answering. The following morning arrived with the particular coldness of Yorkshire in November, not dramatic, not violent. Simply a settled grey intention to remain cold until spring decided otherwise. Nora was in the east corridor by 6:30. The flagstones here were the oldest in the house, uneven in the way of things that have been walked on for 200 years, and they required a specific technique. The brush at an angle, pressure into the gaps, a second pass with clean water before the first had time to dry or else it left a film. She had learned this in her first week. She had learned most things in her first week. Which rooms were Mrs. Harris' territory. Which senior maids considered it beneath them to acknowledge a new girl, which doors were always locked and which were only usually locked, which hours were genuinely empty and which only appeared to be. She was thinking about the library. The library door was 12 feet ahead of her. And the library was cleaned on Fridays by Margaret, the senior housemaid, who was meticulous and efficient and finished in under an hour. Nora had watched the schedule for 6 weeks. She had tried twice to find a reason to enter the library in the normal course of her duties and been redirected both times, once by the schedule, once by Mrs. Harris herself, who had looked at her with the flat suspicion of a woman who has learned to distrust initiative in the lower staff. The letter she was looking for might not even be there. She understood that. Her father had told her, in the last winter before everything changed, that he had written to the old Duke, the previous Duke, his Grace's father, dead now 3 years, about the matter of the disputed land boundary, and that the old Duke had promised to keep his response somewhere safe. A record, her father had said, in the mild way he had of treating consequential things as though they were simply interesting. In case it ever becomes necessary. It had become necessary. She heard Finn before she saw him, a soft sound of paw on stone, unhurried, from the direction of the training yard entrance. The gate at the end of the corridor stood half open in the way she had come to recognize. Someone, again, had failed to secure it properly. Finn came around the corner and stopped when he saw her. His tail moved once. She looked at him. He looked at her, with that particular grey attentiveness that had unsettled her the first time and no longer did. "No," she said. Very quietly. He sat down. "That isn't better," she told him, equally quietly, because she had discovered that speaking to him in a normal register felt less absurd than whispering. "You need to go back." Finn appeared to consider this. He tilted his head at a slight angle. And the morning light from the corridor window caught the grey of his coat and turned it briefly silver. He was, she thought for the 100th time, a genuinely extraordinary animal, not in the way that dogs were sometimes called extraordinary by people who simply meant large, but in the actual sense of a creature that operated according to an interior logic that had nothing to do with whether you found it convenient. She went back to her scrubbing. If she ignored him, he usually wandered back in his own time. From above and behind her, from the direction of the library, she heard the faint sound of a window being raised. She did not look up. She kept her brush at the correct angle, maintained the pressure. Watched the grey water sheet away from the stone. Finn had lain down now, at the edge of her peripheral vision, chin on his forepaws, entirely at ease. "You are going to cause me serious trouble," she thought at him, not for the first time. That he sighed heavily, the way large dogs do. As though the weight of existence were a mild inconvenience, and then because she was tired, because it was 6:30 in the morning and she had been awake since 5. Because in 4 months this creature was the only living thing in Westmere Park that had looked at her as though she were simply a person, without assessment, without hierarchy, without the particular measuring quality that everyone else brought to every interaction. She paused in her scrubbing, turned her head, and looked at him. He was already looking at her. Something happened in her chest that she did not examine too closely. A loosening. A brief, involuntary sensation of being known, was the only word she had for it, inadequate as it was. Known without permission asked or given. In the straightforward way of a creature who has no use for the social architecture that requires humans to perform ignorance of what they can plainly see. She turned back to her work. She was almost certainly imagining things. I in the library above, Alaric Vane, 8th Duke of Westmere, stood at the window with a letter he was no longer reading. He had been at his correspondence since 5, a habit formed during the war and never relinquished. When the hours before dawn were the only ones that reliably belonged to him. The letter in his hand was from his solicitor in London and concerned the eastern parcel of land that had been in disputed boundary with the former Blackwood estate. A matter that had been technically unresolved since his father's time and which no one had found particularly urgent to resolve, since the Blackwood estate had passed to a Mr. Oliver Blackwood 3 years ago and Mr. Oliver Blackwood had shown no interest in pursuing the question. He had, in fact, been in the process of deciding to have Hartley write to Blackwood's solicitor when he had heard the gate and looked up from habit. Finn had escaped the kennel yard twice in the past month. And the master of hounds was growing apologetic about it and seen the girl in the corridor below. She was the new scullery maid. He knew her in the approximate way that he knew all his household staff, a face, a position. The fact of her presence in rooms he sometimes moved through. Mrs. Harris had mentioned her once, with the particular quality of mention that was not quite a complaint but was structured like one. And he had filed this away without particular interest. He had seen Finn sit down. He had watched, and he was aware this was not a thing he typically did, stand at library windows watching the corridor below the girl tell the dog, in what appeared to be a perfectly conversational tone, that he needed to go back. He had watched Finn lie down with every appearance of comfort and intention. He had watched the girl go back to her work, then he had watched her stop, turn her head, look at the dog. It was a brief moment, entirely without event. The girl looked at Finn. Finn looked at the girl. No one moved. The morning light was coming in from the east-facing window at the corridor's end, and it caught the side of the girl's face, and Alaric Vane, who had not found himself watching a woman's face in some considerable time, noted that her expression was not soft. That was not quite the word. Something quieter than soft. Something the way a held breath is quiet. Just before a person allows themselves to exhale, then she turned back to the flagstones, and the moment ended, and Finn remained lying where he was, chin on his paws. In the absolute ease of an animal who has arranged exactly what he wanted. His Grace set down the letter from his solicitor. He picked up a different sheet of paper, blank, and considered it for a moment. Then he set it back down. It was nothing. Probably. Finn had been erratic since his father died, the animal had been the old Duke's more than his, and Alaric had inherited him with everything else. The title and the land and the debts and the particular specific melancholy of a house that had been someone else's home before it became his responsibility, the girl was nothing. A face in a corridor. He went back to his correspondence, but he did not write to Blackwood's solicitor that morning. And later he would not be able to say precisely why. She had memorized the household schedule down to its smallest intervals. Friday was Margaret's day for the library. Thursday evening, between 9 and 10, was when Mrs. Harris did her final round of the upper corridor and then retired to her sitting room with a pot of tea and a ledger. The footman who locked the eastern wing doors did so at 8:30, but the library door Nora had checked this 3 times, carefully. Over 6 weeks locked from the inside, and the key hung on a hook beside the mantelpiece. Which meant that the door was only locked when someone inside it chose to lock it at n01 slept in the eastern wing. On Thursday night she waited until the house had settled into its particular quality of late silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a large building breathing slowly around its sleeping occupants, and then she rose, dressed in the dark, and took her candle to the east corridor. The library door opened without resistance. She had been inside once before, briefly, when she had been sent to fetch a specific volume for the housekeeper's inventory and had had approximately 4 minutes in which to see nothing useful at all. Now she stood in the doorway with her candle raised and let herself look properly. It was larger than she had expected, 2 full walls of shelf. Floor to ceiling, with a rolling ladder on iron rails. A reading table in the center. 2 chairs by the fireplace, which was cold. The smell of paper and old leather and something faintly mineral. The specific scent of a room that is used with serious intention. Her father had said the correspondence with the old Duke would be in the estate files. He was a methodical man. Her father had told her. He kept everything. He believed in written records the way other men believe in providence. The estate files, she had learned from careful listening over 3 months, were kept in the library's south-facing shelving, the lower section. Behind glass-fronted cabinets that were not locked, she moved to the south wall. The cabinets were organized by year and subject: land surveys, tenancy agreements, correspondence with solicitors, correspondence with neighbors. She ran her finger along the spines gently, touching as little as possible until she found the section marked correspondence, neighboring estates, and within it, a series of folders arranged by year. She was looking for 1812, which was the year her father had written to the old Duke about the eastern parcel. The year before everything had started to go wrong. She pulled the 1812 folder from the shelf and set it on the reading table. She was so intent on opening it that she did not hear the sound from the armchair by the fireplace until a voice said, quite clearly, "That is estate correspondence." Nora went entirely still. The voice continued, without particular urgency, "I would be interested to know what you expect to find in it." She turned. The chair by the fireplace was not empty. It had been empty when she entered. She had looked. She had been careful, but it was not empty now, or rather, it had not been empty and she had simply failed to see him, because the fireplace was cold and the chair sat in the deepest shadow of the room. And the man sitting in it had apparently been there in the dark long enough to have become part of it. The Duke of Westmere was watching her with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and is mildly curious to see what it turns out to be. He was younger than she had expected. He had seen him only at a distance, crossing the courtyard or speaking with his estate manager, and the distance had given him an abstraction that proximity removed. He was perhaps 32, with a face that had the specific quality of a face that had spent time out of doors in difficult conditions. Weathered without being rough, still without being cold. His eyes, in the candlelight, were dark and entirely level. He was holding a book. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." Her voice came out steady, which surprised her faintly. I had come to." "You were looking at estate correspondence from 1812, he said. "That is what you were doing. I saw you find the folder." He paused. "I have been sitting here for the better part of 2 hours. If you're wondering. I often work in here in the evenings. The chair is comfortable and the fire, when lit, is adequate." Another pause. "Tonight I did not light the fire. I found I preferred to sit in the dark. You did not look carefully enough when you entered, she said nothing that he stood. Which brought him to his full height. He was tall, taller than Shed registered at a distance and crossed to the reading table. He picked up the folder she had placed there and looked at the label. Then he looked at her. Sit down, he said. That I would rather stand. Your Grace, something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not surprise, quite. Something more like attention. Then stand. He set the folder back on the table. Tell me what you are looking for in my father's correspondence. That I cannot tell you that, cannot, he said, or will not, both. Your Grace, the silence that followed had a specific texture, not hostile, not comfortable, but occupied. He was looking at her with the focused quality of a person recalculating something. She looked back at him because looking away would have cost her something she could not afford to spend. There is a letter in that folder, he said, almost conversationally, that I have not read. My father's correspondence from 1812 was extensive, and when he died I read what was necessary and left the rest. I do not know what it contains. He picked up the folder again, opened it, and removed a folded sheet. The letter at the back, she saw. The one written in her father's hand, which she recognized from across the table, which she had been trying to reach for 3 months. He did not open it. He held it and looked at her. I suspect you do. Her heart was beating very loudly. Read something for me, he said abruptly. And crossed to the shelving behind him, and pulled a volume without looking at it, and set it in front of her on the table. Anything. The first passage your eye finds. She looked down. The book was open to a page of dense, close-set text. Latin, a legal commentary, she thought. Bracton or someone of that school, the phrasing formal and precise. She read it. The Latin was straightforward, a passage about the rights of inheritance and the obligations of those who held property in trust. She read it without stumbling, without hesitation. In the even cadence of someone for whom this was not a performance. When she finished, the Duke of Westmere was very quiet. Where did you learn Latin? He said. She said nothing. That he looked at her for a long moment, at her hands, which were reddened from cold water and rough work, at her dress, which was the dress of a scullery maid, at her face, which she kept as still as she was able. Who are you? He said. The candle between them burned without flickering. That I am the girl who scrubs your east corridor, Your Grace. She said. That is all I can tell you. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he set the letter, her father's letter, back in the folder. He set the folder back in the cabinet. He closed the cabinet door. Go back to your room, he said. I will not tell Mrs. Harris you were here. She picked up her candle, and his voice stopped her at the door, not loud, but with the quality of a word that expected to be heard. Do not come back to this room without my knowledge. She went, behind her, in the dark library. She heard the sound of the armchair receiving his weight again, and then silence, and then she was almost certain the quiet sound of the cabinet being opened once more. She did not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the room she shared with the scullery maid Bessie, who was 15 and slept with the absolute confidence of a person who has done nothing complicated, and listened to the house and thought about the Duke's face when she had read the Latin, and the way he had put her father's letter back in the cabinet. And whether that was the action of a man who intended to read it later or a man who intended to use it as leverage. And could not decide which was worst. At 5 she rose and dressed and went down to the east corridor. The morning passed with the particular quality of mornings that are being endured rather than experienced. She scrubbed. She carried water. She beat the dust from the corridor rugs in the cold art and tried to determine, from the normal rhythms of the household, whether anything had changed. Nothing appeared to have changed. At 11 o'clock Mrs. Harris found her in the corridor and told her, in the flat voice she used when delivering instructions she expected to be followed without discussion, that she was to go to the Duke's study. The study was in the west wing, which was the part of the house Nora had entered least. A fire had been lit and the room was warm, a square, functional room, bookshelves on 2 walls, a large desk, 2 chairs angled toward the fireplace. The Duke was standing at the window when she entered. He did not turn immediately. Close the door, he said. She did. He turned then, and crossed to the desk. And sat. He did not gesture to the second chair. She stood in the center of the room and waited, because she had become, in the past 4 months, very accomplished at waiting. That I want to understand something, he said. He spoke in the same even, considered way he had the night before, the voice of a man who was accustomed to being listened to and had stopped requiring it to be demonstrated. You are employed here as a scullery maid. You have been here for 3 months. You have a reference from a household in Leeds. He paused. I had Hartley look it up this morning. The household in Leeds does not appear to exist at the address given. Nora said nothing. You read legal Latin without hesitation. He picked up a pen from the desk and set it down again, not in a restless way, but in the way of a person managing the pace of a conversation deliberately. You moved through my library last night with a familiarity that suggested this was not your first time thinking about what was in it. And you were looking specifically at correspondence from 1812. Which is, he paused, an interesting year. That I did not take anything, your grace, that I know. I looked. He studied her. Sit down, miss, he stopped. I don't know your name. The name in the household register is Nora Field. I don't believe that's your name, it's the name I gave. Your grace, that's not what I said. He waited. When she didn't move toward the chair, something in his face settled, not impatience, she thought, but something more like a decision being made. I'm not going to have you dismissed, he said. That is not what this conversation is. She looked at him directly for the first time since entering the room. Then what is this conversation, your grace? I haven't decided yet. He leaned back. I read the letter last night. After you left. He watched her face when he said it. And she was aware of him watching, and kept her expression still. It was written by a man named Edward Blackwood. He was the Baron Blackwood, whose estate bordered the eastern edge of my land. He died 2 years ago. A pause. He writes to my father about a land boundary dispute that had been quietly ongoing for several years, and he references certain verbal agreements between them. And he asks my father to set down in writing what he had promised. He refers, in the letter, to his daughter, whom he describes as the Duke. Glanced at the paper on his desk, which she now saw was covered in his own handwriting notes, as the person most likely to need this correspondence to be clear. In the event that things became complicated, the room was very warm. She was standing in the center of the Duke's study in a scullery maid's dress, and her father had been dead for 2 years, and he had apparently known, even then, that things might become complicated and had tried, in his quiet methodical way, to leave her something to work with. She pressed her hands together in front of her. The letter does not prove anything specific, she said, and her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. On its own.no. The Duke agreed. It establishes that a conversation took place and that my father witnessed certain intentions. It would be supporting evidence, not primary. In a legal proceeding, you would need something more. He looked at her steadily. Which is presumably why you came back for it. She said nothing. You are his daughter, the Duke said. It was not a question. She met his eyes. I am the girl who scrubs your east corridor. Your grace. That is all I am able to tell you at present. The silence lasted long enough that she counted 7 seconds of it. Then I have a practical question, he said at last. You have no reference. Your name is false. Your presence in my household was obtained by means that would, technically, constitute grounds for dismissal. He picked up the pen again. If I dismiss you now, where will you go? I don't know, she said. It was the first entirely truthful answer she had given him. That he set the pen down. He stood, and moved to the fireplace, and stood with his back to her, looking at the fire, for long enough that she began to wonder if he had forgotten she was there. You will continue your work, he said, to the fireplace. In this household, in your current position. She waited. If I have further questions, he continued, I will ask them. You will not be required to answer what you cannot answer. He turned. But I will find out what I want to know through my own means. And when I do, he looked at her with the specific directness of a man making a statement he intended to be remembered. We will have a different conversation. Yes, Your Grace, you may go. She went to the door. Her hand was on the handle when he spoke again. Miss Field, he said. And she heard the deliberate quality in the name, the acknowledgement that he knew it was not hers, set inside the politeness of using it anyway. My father kept his promises. I have found, in general, that it is useful to know that about a man before forming conclusions about the matters he was involved in. She stood in the doorway. Thank you, Your Grace, she said. She left at I and the corridor. She walked back toward the east wing at the same pace she always walked. Because pace was the thing that told watchers whether something had changed. Nothing had changed. She was still the girl who scrubbed the flagstones. She was still nobody, but her father's letter was in the Duke's desk now, and the Duke of Westmere had just told her. In the oblique vocabulary of a man who said less than he meant, that he intended to investigate, she turned the corner into the east corridor. Finn was lying across the middle of the passage, directly in her path. In the complete ease of an animal with no sense of inconvenience. He raised his head when he saw her. His tail moved once. She stopped. She looked at him for a moment, at his gray face, his pale serious eyes, the simple unambiguous fact of his presence. Don't, she said. Very quietly, but she reached down, just once, and rested her hand on the top of his head before she stepped around him and went back to her work. The notice had been on the mantelpiece for 3 days when Mrs. Harris made her move. Nora had been expecting something. She had learned, in her months at Westmere Park, that Mrs. Harris operated according to a specific internal calendar. She gathered, she waited, and then she acted at a moment of her own choosing, which was always a moment when the person she was acting against had begun to believe the danger had passed. It was, Nora thought, quite an effective method. It had worked on 2 other members of staff since her arrival, both of whom had left without references. She was in the kitchen yard beating the dust from the morning rugs when Martha appeared at the door with the expression of someone delivering news they expect to enjoy. Mrs. Harris wants everyone in the servants' hall, Martha said. Now, the servants' hall, when Nora entered it, contained the full complement of upper staff. Mrs. Harris at the head of the long table, the 2 senior housemaids flanking her, the footmen arranged along the wall. The cook in the doorway with her arms folded. The arrangement had the quality of something that had been considered in advance. Mrs. Harris waited until Nora had taken her place at the far end, the position of the lowest ranked, and then she spoke. That it has been brought to my attention, she said. In the voice she used when she wanted the whole room to understand she was performing a duty rather than enjoying one, which fooled no one, that a member of this household was seen in the East Wing library on Thursday evening. After the house was locked for the night. No one looked at Nora. This was how it worked. No one looked at the person being discussed until the moment came when looking was the point. The library contains estate correspondence of a sensitive nature. Mrs. Harris continued. It is not a room any member of the lower staff has occasion to enter without instruction. I consider this a serious matter. She paused. I have therefore brought it to His Grace's attention and asked for guidance on how to proceed. The door opened. Nora did not allow herself to look at it immediately. She counted 2 seconds. Which was the length of time a person needed to appear merely attentive rather than anxious, and then turned with everyone else. The Duke of Westmere stood in the doorway. He looked at the assembled room with the unhurried survey of a man who has entered spaces arranged for his benefit many times, and finds the arrangement neither flattering nor interesting. Then he looked at Mrs. Harris. You have a concern, Mrs. Harris? Yes, Your Grace. Regarding the girl, Mrs. Harris did not look at Nora but gestured in her direction with the slight inclination of her head that served, in her vocabulary, as pointing field. She was seen in the library Thursday evening. Given Your Grace's instructions about the estate correspondence. I asked her to be there, the Duke said. The sentence landed in the room without particular emphasis. He had spoken it in the same register he used for everything, even clear, requiring no support from volume or repetition. He looked at nothing in particular while he said it, and this was somehow the most devastating element of the whole exchange. That he did not find it necessary to look at Mrs. Harris to correct her. Mrs. Harris' expression underwent a series of small adjustments that she was almost successful in suppressing. Your Grace. I had occasion to request a specific volume from the East section on Thursday evening. Field was the staff member available. He moved his gaze to Mrs. Harris then. And the movement was so deliberate that the room seemed to notice it. I was not aware this required a household assembly. The silence had a specific texture. Nora, at the far end of the table, kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes at a point approximately 6 inches above Mrs. Harris' head, because looking at Mrs. Harris directly would have been interpreted as something, and she could not afford anything to be interpreted. Of course, Your Grace. Mrs. Harris said. I apologize for the misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. The Duke said pleasantly. You did not have the full information. Now you do. He left. The room did not immediately reassemble itself. There was a specific quality to the silence that followed, not the silence of acceptance, but the silence of recalibration. Of a room full of people revising their understanding of something. Martha, 3 places down from Nora, was looking at the tabletop with an expression of concentrated study. Mrs. Harris looked at Nora. It was a brief look, and it contained nothing that could be described or repeated. And it lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then she said, in her normal voice, that everyone had duties to return to, and the room dispersed. Nora walked back to the kitchen yard. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. This surprised her slightly. Because her heartbeat had not yet returned to its normal rate, and the gap between the two, the steadiness of her hands and the speed of her heart, felt like a small private achievement. She had been protected. She turned this thought over with the careful attention it deserved. Because it was not a simple thing, and she had learned to be suspicious of things that appeared simple. The Duke had lied for her, or not lied, technically, but had offered a version of events that bore a sufficient resemblance to lying that the distinction was philosophical. He had done this in front of the entire upper staff. He had done it without being asked, without indication. Without any visible effort. She did not know what this meant. She was still considering it when she became aware that Finn was behind her. She hadn't heard him, she rarely did, but when she turned he was there, at the entrance to the kitchen yard. With his grey head slightly tilted and his pale eyes on her face. He crossed the yard in his unhurried way and stopped beside her and placed his great head against the back of her hand, not demanding, simply present, in the way he had always been present with her, without agenda. Without requirement, simply here. She stood very still. The kitchen yard was empty. The morning had gone white with cloud, and the cold was the specific cold of Yorkshire in November, settling in complete. Finn's head was warm and heavy against her hand, and she thought about her father, who had also been warm and present in the particular uncomplicated way of people who do not require you to explain yourself to them. She did not cry. She had not cried since the first night on the steps. And she did not intend to begin again, but she left her hand where it was for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went back to her rugs. The summons came on a Wednesday, 11 days after the servants' hall assembly. In the form of a folded note delivered to Nora by the upstairs maid who served the Dowager Duchess, written in a hand that was old but entirely precise. Come to the blue sitting room at 3 o'clock. Use the main staircase. Tell no one. The Dowager Duchess of Westmere, Lady Eugenia Vane, who had been a duke's daughter before she became a duke's wife and a duke's mother, and had therefore spent her entire life at the precise center of the world she occupied, was 71 years old and had the quality of very old trees, deeply rooted, largely undisturbed by weather, and considerably more observant of their surroundings than they appeared. Nora had seen her twice. Once at a distance, being assisted into a carriage, and once from behind a door she had been cleaning when the Dowager had passed through the corridor with her companion, and had paused, and looked directly at the door, and then continued walking. Nora had stood very still behind that door for a full minute after the footsteps faded. The blue sitting room was on the first floor, south-facing. And at 3 o'clock it held the flat winter light of a sun that was doing its best without conviction. The Dowager was in the chair by the window, her hands folded over the head of a cane she did not appear to need for walking, her grey eyes fixed on the door. When Nora entered, close the door, she said, and sit down. I will not have you standing in front of me like a deposition. Nora. Saturday. The Dowager looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone confirming something they have already decided. How long did you think it would take me? She said that. I beg your pardon. Your Grace, to see you. The Dowager's voice was dry and entirely without performance. I am 71 and I have macular trouble in my left eye. But I am not yet sufficiently diminished to mistake Edward Blackwood's daughter for a scullery maid. She paused. You have his eyes. You also have his habit of holding still when you would prefer to do something else. He was exactly the same in conversation. Quite maddening. Until you understood it was restraint rather than obstruction. Nora said nothing. That I knew your father, the Dowager said, more quietly. He was a good man. Not a powerful one, but good. Which is not as common an occurrence as one might hope. He wrote to my husband in 1812 about the land boundary and my husband replied and the matter was in my husband's view settled. And then my husband died, and your father died, and the matter became unsettled again. Apparently. She picked up her teacup, considered it, set it down. I have not interfered in my grandson's management of the estate. It is his estate and he is not a fool. And I find at my age that interference costs more energy than it produces results. She looked at Nora. I have made an exception in your case. What sort of exception, Your Grace? The sort where I tell you that my husband kept copies of all correspondence he considered consequential. The Dowager's eyes were level and exact. He kept them in the archive, yes, but he also kept them in a second location. Which was his habit and which my grandson does not know about because my grandson has never thought to ask me what his grandfather's habits were. She paused. There is a locked case in the study on the second floor of the room that was my husband's private study. Not the working study my grandson uses. The key is behind the clock on the mantelpiece. I am telling you this because I am old enough to have decided that legal processes are slow and uncertain. And that a young woman who has spent 4 months scrubbing floors in someone else's house in order to find a letter deserves to know where the letter is. Nora sat with this for a moment. Why now? She said. You have known for how long? Since your 3rd week. The Dowager said without apology. I waited because I wanted to see what you were. Whether you were here for the correspondence only. Or whether you were here because she paused and looked out the window at the grey November garden because this is the closest land to your father's. Because when one has lost everything, one tends toward what is familiar. Even when it is not technically home. The room was very quiet. That I also waited, the Dowager continued, in a different register. Because my grandson needed time to find you himself. He is a particular kind of man, the sort who must believe he has arrived at a conclusion through his own observation. If I had simply told him what I knew, he would have been thorough and just and entirely efficient. And the matter would have been resolved correctly, and that would have been the end of it. She looked back at Nora. I thought it might be better for both of you if it was not simply the end of it. Nora looked at the Dowager Duchess, who was looking at the garden with the serenity of a woman who has arranged something and is willing to wait for it to develop. You are playing a long game, Your Grace. Nora said that I have been playing long games since before your mother was born. My dear. The Dowager picked up her teacup again. When you are ready to speak fully to the right person, you will find that someone is prepared to listen. She took a sip of tea. That is all I wanted to tell you. You may go. Nora stood. Your Grace. She hesitated at the door. Did my father know? Did he know my uncle would do what he did? The Dowager was quiet for a moment. That I think your father knew that men who are not good become more themselves under pressure, she said. He was a great believer in written records for exactly that reason. He trusted people. And he also made sure he had documentation. She set down her cup. It is a sensible combination, when one has the foresight to arrange it. Nora left. She walked down the main staircase. The Dowager had said to use it. And she was not yet ready to return to the servants' passages, and when she reached the bottom and turned toward the east wing she found that her steps were steadier than they had been in 4 months. There was someone who knew, there was someone who had always known, and had chosen to wait. And had now chosen to speak. She was not entirely alone in this house. She turned the corner into the east corridor. and Finn, who had no business being in the East Corridor at this hour and had evidently come to the same conclusion she had about whose business it was to tell him so, fell into step beside her without ceremony, his great grey shoulder level with her hip. His pace adjusted to hers with the simple unconscious accuracy of an animal that has been keeping pace with someone for long enough that it has become unremarkable. She let him walk with her, just this once. Just to the end of the corridor, the letter arrived on a Friday, which was the day the post came up from the village in the saddlebag of the younger groom, and it was sitting on Alaric's desk when he came in from the morning ride at 9:30. Sealed with his London solicitor's mark and thicker than the usual correspondence that he had written to Hartley 3 weeks ago, the week after the night in the library, though he had not explained this connection to himself at the time. Or had explained it only in the way that one explains things one is not quite ready to examine directly, which is to say not at all. He had written asking for a routine inquiry into the Blackwood estate transfer of 1812, the probate record, the witnesses to the will, the names of the solicitors involved. He had framed it as a matter of tidying up the boundary question that had been outstanding since his father's time. This was not untrue that he broke the seal. Hartley's letter was 6 pages, which was 3 pages longer than Hartley typically wrote. And this in itself was information. The Blackwood estate had passed to Mr. Oliver Blackwood, younger brother of the late Baron Edward Blackwood, through a will dated the 14th of March, 1812. Registered at the York Probate Court in October of the same year. The will had been witnessed by 2 men, a solicitor named Greer, who had died in 1813, and a justice of the peace named Alderton, who had retired to Bath. Mr. Oliver Blackwood had taken possession of the estate in November 1812. Approximately 6 weeks after his brother's death in September. This much was straightforward. What Hartley had added, in the careful language of a man who understood the weight of what he was writing, occupied the final 3 pages that he had obtained, through a colleague in York. A copy of the original will, the one registered at probate, and had compared it against 2 other documents, a letter written by Baron Blackwood in 1810, held in a private collection, and a contract signed by the Baron in 1808, held in the York County Records. The comparison had been conducted by a specialist in document examination whom Hartley had used previously in a case involving forged tenancy agreements. The specialist's opinion was that the 1812 will showed inconsistencies in the letter formation of specific chara ters, specifically the capital B, the lowercase d, and the numeral 7 that were not present in either of the comparison documents. The inconsistencies were not definitive, Hartley was careful to note, and would not by themselves constitute proof in a court of law. But they were, in his professional view, sufficient to warrant further investigation. Hartley had also noted, almost as an afterthought, in the manner of a man who had buried the most significant thing at the end because he was not certain what to do with it. It may be of interest to your Grace that the Baron's daughter, Miss Eleanor Blackwood, was reported missing from the Blackwood estate in December of 1812. Approximately 6 weeks after her uncle took possession. She was 20 years of age at the time. Her whereabouts remain unknown. Mr. Oliver Blackwood, when contacted by the York Magistrate's Office in 1813, stated that he believed his niece had gone to London with friends and declined to pursue the matter further. Alaric set the letter down that he sat in his chair and looked at the fire and thought about a girl who read legal Latin without hesitation. He thought about the false reference from Leeds. He thought about the way she had said, "I am the girl who scrubs your East Corridor, your Grace," not with defiance, not with resentment, but with the specific quality of a person who has made a decision about what she will and will not do, and intends to hold to it. That he thought about the folder from the estate archive, which was still in his desk drawer, and about his father's note at the bottom of Edward Blackwood's letter, 3 lines in the old Duke's handwriting, which Alaric had read and reread since that night. "I have promised this man that I will bear witness to his true intentions, as distinct from whatever documents may be produced in his name after his death. I set this down here so that if it ever becomes necessary, the record exists." E.B. knows his brother and does not trust the paper to survive him. E.B. knows his brother. Alaric opened his desk drawer and took out the folder. He read his father's note again, then he stood up and went to the door and called for Hartley, not the London solicitor, but the estate manager, Dawson Hartley, who had been at Westmere for 20 years and knew where everything was. The private study on the second floor, Alaric said. My grandfather's room. When was it last inventoried? Hartley considered. The summer after your father passed. Your Grace. Nothing was removed. Your father had asked that it be left as it was. There's a locked case in that room, Alaric said. I want to know what's in it. He found the key where his grandmother had told him where she had not told him. Because they had not had this conversation and he did not yet know that they should, where he would have found it eventually, which was behind the mantel clock in his grandfather's study. On a small hook that was invisible unless one thought to look. That he did not ask himself how he had thought to look there. He had simply looked. The case was mahogany, approximately 18 inches wide, secured with a lock that the key opened with the ease of something well maintained. Inside, arranged in a system that was recognizably his grandfather's chronological, labeled in the old Duke's cramped hand, were the copies of every letter the old Duke had considered consequential, copies of his own responses. Copies of correspondence received. A document at the back of the case. Sealed separately, labeled in ink that had not faded, re. Blackwood testimony of intention, for use if required. Alaric opened it. It was 4 pages. His grandfather's handwriting. Witnessed by 2 signatures at the bottom that he recognized as those of the old Duke's solicitor and his personal secretary, both now dead but whose signatures appeared in enough other documents to be verifiable. It described, in plain and careful language, a conversation between the old Duke and Baron Edward Blackwood that had taken place on the 14th of September, 1812, 1 week before the Baron's death, during which the Baron had stated, in the old Duke's presence, that his true intentions regarding the disposition of his estate were as follows. The property, in its entirety, was to pass to his daughter Eleanor, to be held in trust until her 25th birthday. His brother Oliver was to receive the London investments only. The Baron had expressed concern that his brother might challenge these intentions, and had asked the old Duke to record this conversation as a witness statement of his true wishes. Distinct from whatever formal will might be drawn up, the old Duke had recorded it. The date was September 14th, the will that had sent the estate to Oliver Blackwood was dated the 14th of March 6 months earlier. Alaric read the document twice. Then he sat down in his grandfather's chair, a chair he had not sat in since he was 12 years old, and held the 4 pages in his hands and thought about a 20-year-old girl who had been declared missing by a magistrate and not pursued by the uncle who had taken everything that should have been hers. That he thought about what it costs a person to disappear. What it costs to reappear as someone else, in a house whose walls might contain the only evidence that ever existed of who she was. He thought about 4 months of corridor floors. He set the document back in the case with the careful attention it deserved, and locked it, and put the key in his pocket. Then he went downstairs and told Dawson Hartley to prepare the main hall for a household assembly on Monday morning, and to send an express to Mr. Oliver Blackwood's address in Yorkshire, requesting his presence at Westmere Park on Monday on a matter of the estate boundary urgent, requiring his personal attendance. That he did not tell Hartley anything else. That he did not tell the girl in the East Corridor anything at all. She had waited 4 months. She could wait until Monday. Saturday passed. Sunday passed. Alaric spent Saturday in the estate archive with Dawson Hartley, pulling every document that touched on the Blackwood land boundary survey maps, tenancy records going back to his grandfather's time, the original correspondence between the 2 estates that went back further still. He was building the shape of something. The full outline of a case that his grandfather had apparently foreseen and prepared for, and that no one had yet had occasion to use. That he found, in a box marked Blackwood boundary, miscellaneous. A letter from 1809 in his father's handwriting, a letter to Edward Blackwood confirming the informal agreement about the eastern parcel, the one that Nora had apparently come to find, or part of it. There was also a survey conducted in 1810 at joint expense, which established the boundary precisely and was signed by both estate agents. And there was something he had not expected, a small envelope, unsealed, tucked between the survey and a receipt, containing a folded note in a different hand, a woman's hand, by the character of it, small and neat and slightly hurried, which read, "He will try the witnesses first. Greer is already his. Alderton can be bought or frightened. The daughter should be kept safe. He did not know who M was. He did not know when the note had been written or how it had come to be in his father's papers. He turned it over and found nothing on the verse that he set it aside. It was additional evidence that something had been known, that someone, at some point, had anticipated what Oliver Blackwood intended to do. It was not legally significant on its own. But it was one more piece of a picture that was becoming, the more he looked at it. Not complicated but simple, a simple, deliberate theft from a young woman who had had no one with enough power to stop it, that he kept working. Sunday morning he rode out to the eastern boundary and walked the land himself, a thing he had not done since taking on the estate. Because the boundary question had seemed theoretical and distant, and he had been occupied with more pressing theoretical and distant things. The land was cold and empty and entirely unambiguous in its quality: good arable land on the Blackwood side, 2 farms in reasonable repair. A managed woodland that his father's papers suggested had been generating decent income before 1812. It was not a vast estate. But it was enough. It was enough to have mattered very much to a young woman with nowhere else to go. He stood at the boundary line marked by a row of old stones, half buried in the frozen grass, and looked back at the rise of Westmere Park against the grey sky, and then turned and looked at the Blackwood land, which was being farmed by one of Oliver Blackwood's tenants, and which showed the specific slight neglect of land that no one loves. Her father had stood on this boundary, his father had stood on this boundary with her father, and they had reached an agreement between them, and written it down. And his father had gone further and recorded a conversation in a witness document, because Edward Blackwood had looked at his brother and known he knows his brother. Alaric rode back to Westmere Park in the afternoon. He sat in his study and wrote 2 letters. The first was to his solicitor in London, enclosing copies of the key documents and asking for a formal opinion on their legal weight. The second was shorter, addressed to the York Magistrate's office, requesting confirmation of the outstanding missing persons notice for Miss Eleanor Blackwood, formerly of Blackwood Hall, Yorkshire. He sealed both letters and gave them to the groom for Monday's post. Then he unlocked his desk drawer and looked at the folder containing his father's note and Edward Blackwood's letter. For a long time, she had walked through his servant's entrance with a false name and a false reference, and had spent 4 months on her knees scrubbing his floors in order to be close enough to look for a piece of paper. She had been 20 years old when her uncle had taken her home and her name and whatever future she had expected. She was 24 now, and she was still looking. With the specific patient precision of a person who has decided that the only variable she can control is her own steadiness. He had, in the past 3 weeks, revised his understanding of steadiness considerably. He locked the drawer, outside in the corridor. At some point in the late afternoon he heard it rather than saw it. There was the soft sound of Finn returning from wherever Finn went when he was not in his kennel or the training yard, which was, increasingly, apparently wherever the girl in the East Wing happened to be working. Alaric had stopped remarking on this to the master of hounds. It seemed, at this point. Beside the matter. He stood up and went to the window. The east courtyard below was empty. But from the direction of the kitchen yard he could hear, very faintly, the sound of someone carrying water, the rhythmic sound of a bucket being set down and lifted, and then, underneath it, something he had not heard before from that direction, not quite singing, not quite humming, something between the two, very quiet, in a minor key, the fragment of a melody he did not recognize. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then it stopped. And there was only the bucket again. He stood at the window until the yard was quiet. Monday, he thought. Tomorrow. He went back to his desk. Monday morning arrived with a clarity that Yorkshire did not often produce in November, a hard, cold brightness, the sky a pale and definitive blue. The frost on the courtyard stones catching the early light and holding it. Nora was in the east corridor at 6, as usual. She had not slept well. She had not slept well for the past 3 nights. Which she attributed to the season and the cold and the particular quality of waiting that had settled over her since the dowager's sitting room, the sense of something gathering that she could not see and could not control and could only continue to endure with the steadiness she had been practicing. For 4 months, she did not know about the letters. She did not know about the documents in the mahogany case. She did not know that an express had gone out on Friday to her uncle's address in the West Riding. Or that Dawson Hartley had spent Saturday helping his employer build the shape of a case that was now, by Alaric Vane's private assessment, very nearly complete. She knew only that the house felt different this morning. That the footmen had been moving with purpose since before she came down. That when she had passed the main hall on her way to the east wing, the chairs had been arranged facing the fireplace in a configuration that suggested an assembly rather than a normal gathering. She told herself it had nothing to do with her. She was still telling herself this at 9:30 when Dawson Hartley appeared at the entrance to the east corridor and Dee said, with the careful neutrality of a man delivering a message he has been asked to deliver without interpretation, "His Grace requests your presence in the main hall, Field." She set down her brush. "Now?" She said. "Yes," said Hartley. The main hall was full, not crowded. It was a large room, high-ceilinged, with the particular formal quality of a space designed to make its occupants aware of proportion, but the upper staff were assembled along the left side, and 4 of the Duke's tenants who she did not recognize were standing near the window. And the Dowager Duchess was in the high-backed chair by the fireplace. That was, Nora registered with the part of her mind that kept registering things regardless of circumstance. Not her usual chair. It was the most prominent chair in the room. Mrs. Harris was present. She stood with the other upper staff, and when Nora entered she looked at her with the flat, waiting quality of a woman who expects to witness something unpleasant, and then Nora saw her uncle. Oliver Blackwood was 53. A broad man who had always carried his size with the specific confidence of someone who had never had reason to consider whether it was warranted. He was standing near the window, slightly apart from the tenants, with the expression of a man who has been told an urgent matter requires his personal attendance and has arrived prepared to be the most important person in the room. He had not yet looked at her. He was looking at the door through which the Duke would enter. Because that was where the importance would come from, and Oliver Blackwood had always known which direction to face. Then he looked across the room, in the way that people's eyes move when they are in an unfamiliar space, cataloguing the occupants out of habit. He saw her. The change in his face was very small and very complete. A contraction, a rapid reassessment. A quality of calculation appearing behind his eyes that she recognized because she had watched it her whole childhood. That specific expression he wore when a situation had developed in a direction he had not anticipated and he was already working out what to do about it. She looked back at him. Oddly, she did not speak. She had nothing to say to him here, in this room, in front of these people. She had nothing to say to him that she had not already said in her own mind 1,000 times. And none of those iterations had required an audience. He looked away first. The Duke entered from the side door. He crossed to the center of the room without haste. And the room arranged itself around him in the way that rooms do when the person at the center has the specific quality of not requiring arrangement. It simply happens, because the alternative is awkward. He did not look at Nora when he entered. He looked at the room as a whole. And then at Oliver Blackwood, and then he set a leather case on the table beside him and opened it. "Thank you for coming," he said, to the room in general and to no one in particular. "I will be brief, as the matter is straightforward," Oliver Blackwood said, with the heartiness of a man establishing his position early. "Your Grace, I confess I was surprised by the urgency of your note. I hope there's no difficulty with the boundary question. I've always considered it more or less settled. And am sure we can. The boundary question is not why I asked you here," the Duke said. Oliver Blackwood stopped. "I asked you here because I have recently come into possession of several documents that bear on the estate of the late Baron Edward Blackwood. And I believed it appropriate that you be present when I described their contents." The Duke removed a paper from the case. The first document, Nora saw, was the copy of Hartley's letter, or perhaps the specialist's report. She could not read it from where she stood. Specifically, a formal opinion from a document examiner retained by my London solicitor, regarding the will submitted to York Probate in October of 1812. The room was very quiet. The opinion concludes that the will shows inconsistencies in letter formation inconsistent with documents verified to be in Baron Blackwood's hand. The inconsistencies are concentrated in specific characters, and are, in the specialist's view, indicative of forgery. The Duke set the first document down and took up the second. Additionally, a witness statement, executed by my late father, the 7th Duke of Westmere, and countersigned by his solicitor and personal secretary, recording a conversation between my father and Baron Edward Blackwood on the 14th of September, 1812. He looked up. the Baron died on the 21st of September. 1812, 1 week after the conversation my father recorded, Oliver Blackwood's face had undergone a series of changes in the past 30 seconds. It had moved through surprise, recalculation, and something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. And had arrived at a position that Nora recognized as the one he defaulted to when cornered, an aggressive reasonableness, the posture of a man preparing to negotiate. "Your Grace," he said, "I'm sure whatever your father wrote was entirely well-intentioned. But a private conversation recorded after the fact cannot simply override a legally registered." The statement was executed on the 14th of September, the Duke said. And registered with my father's solicitor on the 15th. It predates your brother's death by 6 days. He set the second document down. It is not a private note. It is a witnessed legal statement. My solicitor's opinion is that it constitutes significant evidence in any proceeding regarding the vow. Editi of the will. A pause. Which is to say, Mr. Blackwood, that if you would like to challenge it, you are welcome to do so. In a court of law. At which point all of these documents will be submitted in evidence, and the forgery opinion will also be submitted. And the proceedings will be a matter of public record. Oliver Blackwood said nothing. The Duke turned that he looked at Nora for the first time since she had entered the room, and his expression was the same as it always was, even, considered. Giving nothing away, but there was something underneath it that she had not seen before, or had not allowed herself to see, which was the expression of a person who has decided something. "Miss Blackwood," he said. The name fell into the room like a stone into still water. She heard it move. She heard it reach the walls and come back. She was aware of Mrs. Harris, somewhere to her left, going entirely still. She was aware of her uncle, by the window, recalculating furiously. She was aware of the Dowager Duchess, in the high-backed chair, looking at the fire with the serenity of a woman who has seen the thing she was waiting to see. She was aware of Finn. She had not noticed him when she entered. She had been looking at her uncle, but he was there, she saw now, sitting at the edge of the room beside the side door. With the quiet of an animal who has come to a place and found it exactly as expected. He was not looking at the Duke, and he was not looking at Oliver Blackwood. He was looking at her, in the level, certain way he had always looked at her. From the first night on the steps when he had put his head in her lap and she had been too afraid to move, she straightened, not visibly. It was not a performance. It was simply the thing that happened when she stopped holding something that she had been holding for a very long time. Something released in her spine. She stood at her full height, which was not remarkable, but which was hers. "Your Grace," she said, "the documents I have described establish, in my legal counsel's opinion, that the estate of the late Baron Edward Blackwood, comprising Blackwood Hall, the associated farmland, and the managed woodland on the eastern boundary, was transferred to Mr. Oliver Blackwood under a fraudulent instrument." The Duke's voice remained even. And this evenness was, Nora thought, the most devastating thing about it. It required no anger, no accusation, no elevation of register, because the facts themselves were doing the work and he knew it. The true intention of the late Baron, as recorded by my father, was that the estate should pass to his daughter, Miss Eleanor Blackwood. He looked at Oliver. "I am prepared to give you the opportunity to correct this before the matter proceeds to a court. You will sign a deed of transfer, witnessed and legal, returning the estate in its entirety to Miss Blackwood's possession. My solicitor will have the document prepared by Wednesday." Oliver Blackwood looked at his niece. She met his eyes. She had thought, sometimes, about what she would feel in this moment, whether there would be triumph, or grief, or the specific cold satisfaction of a long wait ending. She had not expected to feel as calm as she did. She felt the way the house had felt this morning, clear, and cold, and fully itself. "You have nothing," Oliver said. And his voice had lost the heartiness and arrived at something quieter and uglier. A dead man's conversation recorded by another dead man. A specialist's opinion that proves nothing definitively. "You cannot." "I have my father's word," the Duke said. "Which is recorded, witnessed, and dated. You are welcome to test it against yours." A pause, precisely calibrated. In public, Oliver Blackwood looked around the room at the tenants, at the staff, at the dowager in her chair and understood. In the way that a person understands when the accounting has been done and the numbers are not in their favor. That the audience was not incidental. The audience was the point. Whatever he said next would be said in front of witnesses. Whatever he did next would be known. He looked back at the Duke. Wednesday, he said, Wednesday. The Duke confirmed. My solicitor will be here at 10. Oliver Blackwood left. The room did not move immediately. Then it moved all at once, a collective exhale, a shifting of weight. The specific sound of a space returning to its normal dimensions after having been held briefly outside them. Finn stood up from his place by the side door and crossed the room without haste and sat down beside Nora's feet. He did not make a sound. He simply sat. As he had always sat when he chose to be somewhere, with the complete conviction of an animal that has arrived at the correct location and sees no reason to justify the decision. Nora looked down at him. She did not trust herself to look at anything else just yet. The tenants left first. Then the staff dispersing with the particular quiet of people who have witnessed something significant and have not yet decided what to do with it. Mrs. Harris left without looking at anyone, which was, Nora thought, a kind of answer in itself. The dowager rose from her chair, accepted her cane from her companion, and paused beside Nora on her way to the door. She did not speak. She looked at Nora for a moment with the expression she had worn in the blue sitting room, the look of a woman confirming something she had already decided, and then she inclined her head. Very slightly, in the manner of a person acknowledging a thing done correctly. Then she left. Dawson Hartley cleared away the remaining chairs. The Duke spoke to him briefly, and Hartley nodded and withdrew, and then it was the three of them, the Duke, standing by the table, Nora by the fireplace where Finn had settled at her feet, and Oliver Blackwood, who had not moved from his position by the window. The study, the Duke said. All three of us. The study was warmer than the main hall, and smaller. And the shift in scale made it more difficult to maintain the particular quality of distance that large rooms permitted. Oliver Blackwood stood in the center and looked around him with the expression of a man taking inventory, which was, Nora had always thought, the thing he did when he was uncertain. He looked at objects because objects, unlike people, stayed where you put them. The Duke stood behind his desk. He did not sit. The deed of transfer will restore the estate and all associated income from the date of my taking possession, Oliver said. Without preamble, in the tone of a man who has revised his position and is presenting the revision as though it were always the position. I assume that is the intention. The deed will restore the estate, the farmland, and the woodland. The Duke said. The income from the 3 years of your tenancy will be assessed by my solicitor against the costs of maintenance and management. And the net sum will be determined accordingly. You will also return any movable property removed from Blackwood Hall at the time of transfer. A pause. My solicitor will provide a specific list. I would suggest you prepare your household to cooperate with the inventory. Oliver's jaw tightened. The T is there are items that were my brother's personally. Your brother's personal effects pass with the estate to his heir, the Duke said. That is the law. Mr. Blackwood. I did not write it. A silence. Oliver turned to Nora. He looked at her with the expression he had always used with her, the one that combined a surface reasonableness with an underneath assessment of how much resistance she was likely to offer, and said, in the voice she remembered from her father's funeral, smooth and arranged, Eleanor. Whatever has been said here today, I want you to understand that everything I did in the belief that your father. No, Nora said that it was a single syllable, and she said it without raising her voice. Without moving, without any particular emphasis beyond the simple fact of its completeness. Oliver stopped. You don't need to say it. She said. I have known what you did and why you did it for 3 years. I have had considerable time to consider whether there was any version of it that was anything other than what it was. She looked at him with the steadiness she had been practicing for 4 months, which felt, now, not like a practice but simply like the way she looked at things. There isn't, Eleanor. My father said, she said, that he believed you would take care of everything he left behind. She felt the words in her chest as she said them, the specific weight of her father's voice. His particular quality of measured hopefulness in the face of evidence that might have suggested a different assessment. I think he meant me. I don't believe he meant the land. Oliver Blackwood looked at her for a long moment. She had expected, she realized, to feel something more complicated in this moment, some residue of the grief and anger she had carried for 3 years, some difficulty in speaking past it. But the grief was still there and the anger was still there, and she was simply speaking through them, the way one speaks in difficult weather. By continuing, the land can be replaced, she said. He couldn't. She stopped, because that was all she intended to say. She had not prepared a speech. She had not rehearsed a confrontation. She had simply, over 4 months of corridor floors, arrived at a clarity about what mattered and what didn't. And it turned out that what she wanted to say to her uncle was exactly as short as that. Oliver looked at the Duke. The Duke was looking at the fireplace with the expression of a man who has decided that this portion of the conversation does not require his participation, which was, in itself, a form of participation. Wednesday, Oliver said. 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock, the Duke confirmed. To the fireplace, Oliver Blackwood left. The study was quiet. Nora stood beside the desk and listened to her uncle's footsteps cross the hall and the front door open and close. And then she listened to the house settle back into its normal sounds: the fire, the wind against the east-facing windows, Finn's breathing from his position at her feet. Sit down, the Duke said. And this time it was not the voice from the night in the library, the voice of assessment, but something different, a register she had not heard from him before, which was simply the voice of a man speaking to a person he was concerned about. Saturday. He remained standing for a moment. Then he crossed to the side table where a decanter stood and poured 2 small glasses and set one in front of her without asking whether she wanted it. When did you arrive? At Westmere, he said. He sat then, across from her, which put them at the same level, which she noticed. The 3rd of August, she said. I walked from the village. I'd been in Leeds for a year before that. Before Leeds I was in Harrogate. And before Harrogate I was in York. She paused. I moved when people started to recognize me. How old were you when you left Blackwood Hall? 20. She looked at the glass. He gave me 3 days. He was generous about it. In his way he could have had me removed immediately. He gave me 3 days to collect what I could carry and make arrangements. She picked up the glass. I think he believed I would simply disappear. That it would be easier for everyone. A pause. It almost was. The Duke said nothing. Which was the correct response. That I didn't know about your father's statement, she said. I knew he had written to your father and that your father had replied. And I knew my father had said the old Duke was a reliable man. I thought there might be correspondence. I didn't know. She stopped. I didn't know your father had gone that far. He was a thorough man, the Duke said. In some respects, yes. She looked up. I would like to thank him. If that's possible. Posthumously. Something moved in the Duke's expression, not a smile, not quite, but the thing that precedes one in a face that is not accustomed to them. He would have found that embarrassing. He said. He did what he thought was right and considered the matter closed. The thanks would have confused him. Then I'll thank you, she said. For the inquiry. For the letters. For she paused. The library, the first night. For not having me dismissed. You read Latin competently. He said. It seemed wasteful. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the same directness he had used in the library, in the study, in every conversation they had had, but there was something in it now that had not been there before. Or had been there and she had not allowed herself to see it, which was that the directness was not only the attention of a man assessing a situation. It was the attention of a man looking at a specific person because he wanted to look at that specific person. She looked away first. This time, what happens now? She said. Wednesday, the deed is signed. My solicitor will file with the York Court. The process will take several months to complete formally. But your possession of Blackwood Hall will be established in writing by the end of the week. He paused. You are welcome to remain at Westmere in the interim. In a capacity other than the East Corridor. What capacity? He considered. The library requires organization. My father left it in good order, but I have not maintained it. The estate correspondence in particular is in need of a system. He looked at her. You already know where most of it is. She thought about the library, the south-facing shelves. The estate files in their cabinets, the rolling ladder on its iron rails, the smell of paper and old leather, and the specific mineral scent of serious intention. She thought about walking into it for the first time with 4 minutes to look and seeing nothing useful at all. Yes. She said. I know where most of it is. She found the library at night, again, not by necessity this time. She was not sneaking, was not carrying a candle she needed to shield, was not listening for footsteps. She had simply found, at 9:30 on the Monday evening after everything, that she could not sleep, and that the room she wanted to be in was the one where it had started. She took a lamp from the hall table and walked through the east wing without hurrying, and the door opened for her as it always had. And the room received her in the way of rooms that have been returned to often enough to carry something of the person who returns. She went to the south-facing shelves. The 1812 folder was back in its place. The Duke had returned it, she assumed, after the assembly, or perhaps after the study. Or perhaps at some point in between, because he was a man who put things back where they belonged. She took it from the shelf and carried it to the table and sat, and opened it, and found the letter at the back, her father's handwriting. She had not read it in full. She had not been allowed to. That first night, had been interrupted before she reached the second page. She read it now, slowly, in the lamplight, in the quiet of a house that had settled into sleep around her. It was a careful letter. Her father had always been careful in writing. He distrusted eloquence, he used to say, because eloquence was too easy to perform. He had written to the old Duke in the plain and specific language of a man setting down facts he considered important, the boundary agreement, the verbal arrangement about the eastern parcel, his wishes regarding the estate. And then, at the end of the second page, a paragraph that was not about the land at all. I write also about my daughter, who is 20 years old and who has more sense than I have always given her credit for. She will manage without me, I think. Better than she believes she will. But she should not have to manage alone if it can be helped, and I ask you, as a man who has always kept his word in my experience, to keep a record of what I have told you today, so that if the time comes when she needs it, it exists. She knows where to look. I have told her to come to you if she needs to. I hope she will not need to. But she is her mother's daughter in at least one respect, which is that she does not ask for help easily. And I would rather she had the door open than find it locked when she arrives. Nora set the letter down. She sat in the lamplight and looked at it and thought about her father, who had known he was dying and had spent some of his remaining energy writing to a neighboring duke about a land boundary, and then, at the end, had written a paragraph about his daughter and the unlocked door. She does not ask for help easily. She had not. She had not asked for help for 4 months, had scrubbed floors and carried water and told herself it was temporary, told herself she had a plan. Told herself she was managing. She had been managing. But she had also been, underneath the managing, entirely alone in a way that had become so familiar she had stopped noticing it. The way one stops noticing a chronic pain after a certain point. She heard the door. She did not look up immediately. She had learned, over 4 months, the specific discipline of not looking up at every sound. Because looking up at every sound was how a person's attention could be read. She finished the sentence she was on, which was the last sentence of the letter, and then she looked up. The Duke stood in the doorway with a lamp of his own, still dressed. Which meant he had not yet been to bed or had risen again. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive and is taking a moment to confirm that he has arrived correctly. That I thought you might be here, he said. That I wanted to read it. She said. The whole letter. I didn't get to finish it. The first time that he came into the room and set his lamp on the table across from her, and sat in the chair opposite, the same arrangement as the study, the same level, which she had noticed he did deliberately. Or at least had done consistently enough to suggest habit. The last paragraph, she said, yes. He had clearly read it. He knew you would come here. That he knew I would come somewhere. She said. He didn't know it would take me 2 years to decide on where. She looked at the letter. He was more confident in my sense of direction than I was that he described you accurately, the Duke said. And there was a quality in his voice that was not quite careful and not quite unguarded, something between the two, in the register of a man choosing words with attention. In my experience, she looked up. He was looking at her with the directness that had been there since the library. Since the study, since the assembly, the attention of a person looking at a specific person, but it was different now, or she was different now. Or the room was different at 9:30 on a Monday evening with 2 lamps and the letter on the table between them, and no more pretenses about who she was or why she was here. You came here for a document, he said. Which you have now read, yes, and you have your estate returning to you through legal process. So the purpose that brought you to Westmere is fulfilled. He looked at her steadily. You could go to Blackwood Hall as soon as it is habitable. You don't need to stay. No. She said. I don't need to. A silence. Eleanor, he said, and she heard in it what she had heard when he said Miss Blackwood in the main hall, the deliberate quality of a name chosen because it was hers, but different, smaller, without the audience and the occasion. Just a name said in a room to a person, the way names are said when they are the whole point. I want to tell you something, and I would like to say it clearly so there is no ambiguity. Because I have found that ambiguity tends to create situations that require additional months of corridor floors to resolve. She felt something loosen in her chest. Finn knew what you were before I did, he said. He has an advantage over me in that respect. He doesn't have to weigh evidence or consider alternative interpretations. He simply knows. I required more time. He looked at her with the evenness that was, she had come to understand, not distance but its opposite. The expression of a man who is entirely present and has decided to be entirely honest about it. I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the night you read Latin in the dark and then told me you were only the girl who scrubs the corridor. Not because of what it suggested about your eyed tidy. Because of what it told me about what kind of person you are. She was looking at him. You could have told me, he said. That first night. You had enough. The letter, the circumstantial evidence. My father's history of dealing with yours. You could have made a case and asked me to investigate, and it would have been, in all probability, quicker. He paused. You didn't. Because you didn't know whether you could trust me. Because you have been let down sufficiently badly to have developed a sensible policy of not trusting people with things they could use against you until you are certain. He looked at the letter. Then back at her. That is not a criticism. I want you to know that I understand why you did it that way. I would have done it the same way, would you? She said that I have spent 3 years managing an estate I inherited without wanting it, and a title I did not feel I had earned, in a house full of people looking to me to be the thing my father was, which I am not. He said it without self-pity, the way he said everything as a fact being reported. Not a feeling being performed. I have found that the simplest approach is to continue. To do the work. To be useful. To not ask for anything beyond what the situation requires. He looked at her steadily. I recognize the method. She was quiet for a moment. It's lonely, she said. Yes. He said. It is. The lamp between them burned without flickering. Outside, the November wind had settled, and the house was quiet in the specific way it was quiet late at night, not empty, but resting. That I would like to stay. She said. Not as a member of the household staff. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I will have somewhere else to go, by the end of the week, by your own account. She met his eyes. Because I want to be here. He looked at her for a long moment. The library does require organization. He said that I know where most of it is. She said, you've mentioned that. She smiled. It was small and it was genuine, and it arrived without her planning it, in the way of things that are simply true. Eleanor, he said. He did not reach across the table. He simply said her name. In the same way he had said it before, and let it be what it was. I am very glad you did not find the letter on your first night. She looked at him. If you had found it immediately, he said. You would have left. And I would never have known that Finn was right. 3 months passed. They passed in the way that good months do, not quickly, not slowly, but with the quality of time that is being inhabited rather than endured. The York court moved at its own pace. Which was the pace of institutions that have existed for several centuries and see no reason to alter their relationship with urgency. Dawson Hartley communicated with solicitors. Documents were filed and countersigned and referred upward. Oliver Blackwood signed the deed of transfer on the Wednesday. I as agreed, in the presence of the Duke's solicitor and his own, with the expression of a man completing a transaction he considers unfair but has calculated as the lesser of two available outcomes that he did not speak to Nora again. She did not require him to. Blackwood Hall. When she first went to see it 3 weeks after the assembly, on a cold December morning, riding out from Westmere with Dawson Hartley and one of the Duke's stable hands was smaller than she remembered. This was always the way with the houses of childhood, she supposed. But it was also genuinely in a state of some neglect. The kitchen garden had been let go to frost and weed, 2 of the outbuildings needed their roofs seen to, and the inside of the house had the particular quality of a place that has been managed for income rather than for itself. The furniture adequate and impersonal and none of it hers. The portrait of her parents was still in the morning room. Oliver had not taken it, or had not bothered to. It was not valuable in any monetary sense. Was simply a painting done by a competent local artist in the style of 15 years ago, her father standing, her mother seated. Both of them with the faint self-consciousness of people who have agreed to sit still longer than is natural. Her father's eyes were his own eyes. She had not realized until now that she had forgotten the precise color of them. And seeing them again was both better and worse than she had expected. She stood in front of it for a long time, then she asked Hartley to bring in someone to assess the roof of the east outbuilding, and went to look at the kitchen garden. And began making a list. The work of the months was not only the court and the solicitors and the inventory of what had been removed and what had been left. It was also the library. She had said she would organize it, and she had meant it. And the library turned out to be one of those tasks that expands as it is understood. The estate correspondence alone required a new indexing system, and once she had begun on the correspondence she found the survey maps, and once she had found the survey maps she found the lease agreements. And so on, in the manner of archives, which are structured by the habits of the people who created them rather than the needs of the people who must use them. The Duke came to the library most evenings. This was not new. He had always worked in the library in the evenings. As he had told her on the first night, because the chair was comfortable and the fire, when lit, was adequate. What was new was that he came when she was there, and sat in the chair across the reading table from whatever section she was currently indexing, and worked on his correspondence. And they were in the same room in the specific quiet of 2 people who have discovered that the other person's presence is compatible with thought. Sometimes he asked her questions about what she was finding. Sometimes she asked him about the estate history. Sometimes neither of them said anything. For an hour, and it was not awkward but simply the quality of a room with 2 people in it who do not need to fill the silence to confirm they are there. Finn was usually somewhere in the room. This was now simply understood by the household as a feature of the library's geography. February came with a break in the cold, not warm, not in Yorkshire, but a few days of thin sunshine that made the parkland look like itself again rather than like a study in endurance. On the second Saturday of the month, Nora was in the east courtyard in the late afternoon, throwing a stick for Finn. Which was not something she had done intentionally but which had begun when he had appeared beside her with a stick already in his mouth and the expression of an animal in possession of an idea. And it had seemed unreasonable not to respond to that. She heard the door. The Duke came across the courtyard with his hands in his coat pockets and stopped beside her. And watched Finn retrieve the stick for the 4th time and return it and sit in front of her with the expectation of a creature who has established a satisfactory system and sees no reason to vary it. He has never done that with anyone else. The Duke said that I know. She threw the stick again. He told me, the first time we met, that he told you, not in words. She watched Finn lope across the frost-pale grass. He put his head in my lap on the kitchen steps and looked at me in the way he has. And I understood that he was the sort of animal who decides things about people and then simply acts as though the decision has already been accepted by all parties. The Duke was quiet for a moment. That he has sound judgment. He said that he does. Finn returned, deposited the stick. Sat. Nora looked down at him, at his grey face and his pale serious eyes and the simple, enormous fact of his presence, which had been from the beginning the first thing in this place that had asked nothing of her and offered something anyway. She did not throw the stick again. She put her hand on the top of his head, and he leaned into it with his whole considerable weight. And exhaled the long slow breath of an animal entirely at ease. "That I have something for you," the Duke said. She looked up. That he took his right hand from his coat pocket. In his palm was a ring, gold, simple, with a small oval stone in a setting she recognized because she had last seen it on her mother's hand in a painting in the morning room at Blackwood Hall. She went very still. "That it was in the inventory," he said. "Among the items removed from Blackwood Hall at the time of transfer. My solicitor's letter to Oliver's household listed it specifically, and it was returned with the other effects in December." He looked at it. Then at her. "I have been waiting for an appropriate moment. I am not entirely certain this is it, but Finn appears to have arranged the circumstances, so I am choosing to defer to his judgment." She looked at the ring. She looked at the Duke. She looked at Finn, who was looking between them with the expression of an animal who has been in the right place at the right time and knows it. Her mother's ring. Her mother had worn it every day of her life, and her father had put it on her hand at their wedding in the church in the village. And Nora had last seen it on the morning she left Blackwood Hall with a single bag in 3 days' grace. And she had not let herself think about it since, because some things could not be thought about directly if one intended to keep going. The Duke held it out. She took it. It was lighter than she remembered. Or she was steadier than she had been the last time she held something that mattered this much. "Eleanor," he said. He was looking at her with the attention she had come to understand was not assessment but presence, the expression of a man who is looking at a specific person because she is the specific person he wants to look at. "I am going to ask you something. And I want you to know that the library position remains yours unconditionally, and Finn has already made his preferences clear, and the only variable in question is whether you are willing to extend what is currently." He paused. And in the pause she heard the slight unevenness of a man who is very composed being very sincere, which was its own kind of eloquence, a very satisfactory arrangement. Into a permanent one. Finn put his head between them, not gently. He was a large animal and he had no particular talent for gentleness when motivated, but squarely, his great grey head pushing between her hand and the Duke's, resting on the space between them with the certainty of a creature that has decided where it belongs. The Duke looked down at him. "That I had a speech," he said. "That I don't need a speech." Nora said that. He looked up. She was smiling the same smile as the library. Small and genuine and unplanned, and she was holding her mother's ring in one hand and the stick Finn had abandoned in the other, and the February sun was doing its best in the pale sky above the east courtyard, and she thought about her father, who had said she did not ask for help easily and had left a door open anyway, and about Finn's head in her lap on the kitchen steps on a night when she had not been able to stop crying, and about a man sitting in a dark chair in a library who had said, "Who are you?" and had, in the end, been willing to wait for the full answer. "Yes," she said. Finn exhaled against their hands. The courtyard was quiet and cold and entirely itself, and the ring was warm in her palm, and outside the east boundary wall, just visible above the stones, the bare winter trees of Blackwood Hall's managed woodland stood in the pale afternoon light, waiting, as they had always waited, for spring to decide to begin.